Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMakin, editor-in-chief at the Mises Institute. If you haven't been there lately, be sure and check out our website at mises.org or mises.org. Well, thank you for joining me today. It is early July. It is July 2nd at the time of this recording, and so this seems like an appropriate time to discuss the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. I don't know if you've noticed. It kind of depends on where you're getting your media from. As to whether anybody around us has mentioned that it is, in fact, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Now, I, of course, am very critical routinely with the United States as it exists today, but, and in fact, I've noted many times that basically the current republic that we call the United States has virtually nothing at all to do with the republic founded in the 1770s in North America. However, however one may feel about that, if we like things like freedom, independence, self-determination, a philosophy that tells us that governments are not sent by God to do whatever they want and everyone else must be falling into line, then it is good. It is a good thing to commemorate the Declaration of Independence. It is a good thing to commemorate the American Revolution as it sought to establish independence from this larger state, which was the United Kingdom and the British Empire. Now, to do that today, I want to look into a bit more detail in some of the writings of Murray Rothbard in his book, Conceived in Liberty. This is the 4-volume, more than 1,300-page history book about the American Revolution. Is from the 1970s, and in fact, it's considerably longer than that now because, thanks to the work of Patrick Newman at the Mises Institute, we've added a 5th volume made out of Rothbard's notes and unpublished manuscripts on the topic. So really 5 volumes. But I'm going to be focusing primarily on the 4th volume here, and that is the volume that covers the period leading up to the Revolution and a lot of related issues as to how radical was the Revolution, where did the ideology come from, and what was the nature of this separatist movement that the American revolutionaries put into place. And of course, like most everything that is written by Rothbard, you can find it for free at mises.org as a PDF. Of course, it's such a huge book, I would recommend getting a physical copy of it, and you can also listen to it in audiobook form if you like. But I'm going to be dealing here with parts 2 and 4 of volume 4, and then also part 9 if you want to sort of follow along later. I would recommend, if you haven't really delved into the book at all and you're interested in this topic that we'll be discussing today, just check out parts 2 and 4 and 9 in volume 4. And what Rothbard does in these areas is he really addresses the issue of what was the true philosophical and ideological nature of the revolution, and then as practiced, was it in any sense a pro-freedom movement, right? Was it consistently pro-freedom, and what were the methods used to obtain this freedom? And what Rothbard finds is that, yes, it was very much a radical libertarian revolution in the sense that it sought very much to undo state power, not just British state power, but to undo the power of the state governments in many cases as well, to totally break free of the old oligarchic style of government that had been imposed by the British state, and to not recreate it simply anew in the new thing called the United States. So why does Rothbard spend so much time on this topic of really sending home the idea that, yes, the revolution was very radical and it was a major sea change in the sorts of institutions at the time? Also was, as he reiterates many times, it was a people's revolution. This was not some conspiracy among the ruling classes to trick them into getting independence from Britain so that therefore the ruling classes could then oppress everybody all the more harshly, white and black, by the way, right? Because, of course, you'll get lots of arguments from people at groups like the 1619 Project, remember that, from a few years ago, which were arguing that the American Revolution was just about preserving slavery, extending slavery, and then some might even note that by extension, therefore, it was to, therefore, if you're a good Marxist, you would say, oh, this ruling class then, this bourgeois ruling class was there to oppress the proletariat, the lower classes who weren't on the level of a George Washington or a patrician like Thomas Jefferson or a rich lawyer like John Adams, right? These were people who had concocted the revolution to really protect their own ruling position and then lord it over everybody else. That's a certain narrative that you can get. Rothbard says that's not accurate. This was, in fact, a very disruptive, revolutionary movement that undid most of the institutions that were really keeping in place the ruling regime, and that those who were radicals in opposing British rule were, in fact, opening themselves up to a very fluid situation that may or may not have resulted in them being in a good position afterward. As things turned out, sure, many of the richest patriots, that is, the people who supported the revolution, were still in power afterward. But in many cases, it was, in fact, the state governments were weakened, that government became much more localized, and that the relationship between individuals and the state apparatus, to the extent that it existed, became significantly more balanced. But we have to very much note that when we are talking about all of these phenomena, and what Rothbard is talking about here, when talking about the radicalism of the revolution, when he's talking about the Declaration of Independence and what the writers believed ideologically, he is talking about the context of the 1770s. And this is a problem we often get into when people are talking about the 4th of July and independence and America and what does it mean. They will often act like the new country that declared independence in the 1770s was the same thing as what got created in the 1780s, the late 1780s, with the new second Constitution of the United States. And Rothbard is very clear that those are not the same thing. The United States that was created in the 1770s was envisioned as a new, very loose union of independent sovereign states, as is very clear in the final paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence, when it states this: these United colonies are, and of right and ought to be free and independent states, and they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. Note the repeated use of the plural there. They're not talking about creating this one consolidated republic. They're talking about declaring independence for a group of different independent and sovereign states. Now, by the 1790s, that attitude had changed considerably, but we're talking here about the 1770s and about something that was created anew well before that new Constitution in the 1780s, and certainly well before it started to really take shape in the 1790s under the Federalists. So when people talk in general about, the Declaration of Independence created this America as it now is, completely false. What the American revolutionaries, including the common man, what they thought they were fighting for very often was this very, very loose confederation of new independent states, very, very small, locally run governments within these colonies, which would become these new independent republics. And the idea that, it's going to be this gigantic government with an income tax run from the center, with the world's largest treasury, trillions of dollars spent, this gigantic consolidated thing that would have made no sense to the people who are imagining something new in the late 18th century, but prior to the new creation of that counter-revolutionary, really, Constitution in the 1780s. And that's what Rothbard says later, especially in Volume 5 of Conceived in Liberty, is that was a counter-revolution. We had the real libertarian revolution in the 1770s, and then a bunch of very wealthy guys, fearful that ordinary people might be able to assert their own independence against the state and federal governments, instituted this new, much, much more powerful government in the 1780s, that was a counter-revolution against the real revolution that had taken place. That's something that should always be kept in mind when we're talking about Independence Day, and why it should not be celebrated as just a celebration of America. It should be celebrated as a commemoration of this act of secession, this revolutionary change in institutions, as well as a commemoration of what was envisioned by these revolutionaries in the 1770s, not something that came later with Alexander Hamilton and his central bank and the whiskey tax and all of these massive new innovations that greatly grew the size of the federal government. That's not a product of the 1770s. That's a product of what came after. So why, though, spend so much time dwelling on this idea that the revolution was radical? Rothbard states in a couple of different ways why that is important. He's noting it because there's a problem in historiography. So he's writing in the 70s, and he's noting that the prominent historians of the time, especially those within the conservative movement, but also other prominent historians who were laboring within the context of the 20th century liberal consensus, which basically told us that America at that time, in the 1950s and 60s, was a fruition of all of the ideals of the American Revolution, and that the American state, this especially fighting the commies, was this perfect manifestation of the ideology of Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence at the time. There was some sort of apotheosis of our idea of freedom. And that, by the way, if there were shortcomings in terms of our ideas of freedom, well, then that could all be solved by making the central government more powerful, as was generally argued with the Civil Rights Act and those sorts of things. Just give the federal government more power to do more things, and then it can finally bring about the realization of this ideology of the American revolutionaries. And notice that absent from that formula is a new revolution, right? Any sort of major movement against the status quo, any sort of refusal to accept rule from the center, that was unacceptable. Sure, revolution worked in the late 18th century, but that's no longer acceptable because we have perfect democratic institutions now in America. As it is now is the embodiment of what happened then. And that was very much a driving force within American history books at the time and just the historiography in general. So Rothbard's trying to address that. So he writes this to, I think, sum up what he's trying to accomplish here. He says, especially since the early 1950s, America has been concerned with opposing revolutions throughout the world. In the process, it has generated a historiography that denies its own revolutionary past. This neoconservative view of the American Revolution, echoing the reactionary writer in the pay of the Austrian and English governments of the early 19th century, Friedrich von Gentz, tries to isolate the American Revolution from all the revolutions in the Western world that preceded it and followed it. The American Revolution, this view holds, was unique. It alone of all modern revolution was not really revolutionary. Instead, it was moderate, conservative, dedicated only to preserving existing institutions from British aggrandizement. Furthermore, like all else in America, it was marvelously harmonious and consensual. Unlike the wicked French and other revolutions in Europe, the American Revolution, then, did not upset or change anything. It was therefore not really a revolution at all. Certainly, it was not radical. So then what we find throughout much of Conceived in Liberty is a attempt, and I would say a successful attempt by Rothbard, to really delve into the details of, okay, how did this ideology come into existence, and who were the winners and losers? And there were certainly winners, and there were certainly losers. The Loyalists, the arch conservatives, those who wanted to preserve the status quo in the 1770s. Now, before we proceed, let's just take a few minutes to look at the biggest losers of the revolution, and those were the American Tories, the American Loyalists at the time. And this helps also, I think, gives us some insight into Rothbard's view, his overall view, which was that the revolution was justified and a good thing. But Rothbard also, being honest, doesn't pretend that there were no losers in the revolution, and also that there were no people whose rights were not violated by the revolution. Certainly those people existed. Certainly the way the revolution was conducted ended up violating the rights of the Loyalists in many cases, and Rothbard doesn't attempt to just hand wave that away, ignore it. He goes into quite a bit of detail about it. In fact, he notes that this has been far too much ignored in discussion about the revolution, the treatment of the Loyalists. And a lot of this comes out of the idea that they need to preserve this idea that the American Revolutionary was this very humane and quiet and peaceful affair. And echoing his other comments on the revolutionary nature of the war and his radicalism, Rothbard writes this about the Loyalists. He says, "A myth has been promulgated by neoconservative historians that the American Revolution was a uniquely mild revolution, so mild as to be scarcely a revolution at all. In an America that now frowns strongly on the concept of revolution, this sort of mythologizing should not come as a surprise. The revolutionaries' treatment of its Tory minority, however, scarcely fits this myth. Civil war raged throughout the United States, and Tory terror bands abounded in North and South. An estimated 50,000 American Tories joined the British Army during the course of the Revolution, and during the 1780-81 campaign, 10,000 Loyalists were under arms. In this kind of ferocious civil conflict, in which the life of the Revolution itself was at stake, it is unreasonable to expect consistently libertarian methods of handling the Tories from even the most liberal supporters of the Revolution." The 19th century Canadian historian Egerton Ryerson was right in pointing out the inconsistency of the revolutionaries. Quote, "The Declaration of Independence had been made in the name of and for the professed purposes of liberty, but the very first acts under it were to deprive a large portion of the colonists not only of liberty of action, but liberty of thought and opinion," unquote. And that's the end of the Rothbard quote. We might note that Rothbard then discusses, okay, what did this actually look like in terms of these violations of Tory rights? And he notes that the Congress, really a very nascent Congress at the time, in 1775, was already creating around the country these commissions of safety, these committees of safety, which should the name should, if you know much about the French Revolution, should make you a little fearful of anything that has such a name. In the French Revolution, of course, we had the French Committee of Public Safety, which very much contributed to the terror and just to the general bloodshed of the revolution in the 1790s. And America had its committees of safety in various states. And these committees of safety, they were essentially groups of local pro-revolution people. And then they would go around and they would hunt down Loyalists, those who were publicly opposing the revolution, those who were publicly supporting the crown, those who were trying to recruit troops for Loyalist bands, those sorts of things. These people would get arrested. Washington, in some cases, would send military detachments to put them down. And there wasn't much that was what we might call libertarian about that. And Rothbard is fully aware of this. And he notes also in section 2 of volume 4, he says, "Thus a revolution and revolutionaries dedicated to the cause of liberty moved to suppress crucial liberties of their opposition, an ironic but not unsurprising illustration of the inherent contradiction between liberty and power, a conflict that can all too readily come into play even when power is employed on behalf of liberty." And he goes on to note that perhaps one of the worst events brought about by the Americans, the Patriots, against the Loyalists was what occurred in Virginia in the Norfolk area. There had been a conflict there between British Loyalists and Patriots, and there was a lot of back and forth, shelling of the Norfolk area, some battles between Loyalists and Patriots with bloodshed, mostly on the Loyalist side, because the Loyalists were still fighting old-style, European style, where the Americans were starting to get wise and using more sophisticated guerrilla methods and raiding methods. And so the Loyalists suffered considerably under this. But the language that Rothbard uses shows that he's not exactly making excuses for this. He says, quote, "The Virginia Army on occupying the Norfolk area, recommended that the entire population of the region be forcibly removed to the interior to prevent any trade or intercourse with Dunmore's ships, Dunmore being the leader of the British side on this. And so we're talking the Virginia Army being the American Patriots. They're coming in and they're saying, no, let's move the entire population to the interior so that they cannot help the British on this. Rothbard continues, while this recommendation was never really put into effect, a reign of terror was launched against the Tories in the area. Their homes destroyed and plantations seized. The bulk of them fled the colony. Some went to Scotland, others to England and the West Indies. Many joined the British Army in Boston. Okay, so it should be clear from this, and there's plenty of other sections we could read saying that Rothbard is not pretending that the Loyalists did not exist, and Rothbard is not pretending that the methods used by the American revolutionaries were always peaceful and libertarian, and that always taking into account a consensus of the local population. That simply didn't happen. And it's interesting that a lot of people accuse Rothbard of being rather naive about how war works and that coercion only works to sustain rights and stuff. Anyone who reads Conceived in Liberty will know that these accusations against Rothbard are baseless. Rothbard does not live in a fantasy land of how military force works. He simply has certain rules that he adheres to in terms of what is justified violence and what is unjustified violence. And I think that is the key that tells us why Rothbard comes down on the side of the revolution and not on the side of the Loyalists. And this is important because in any revolutionary situation, in any situation also where we're talking about secession, which one could argue is a type of revolutionary act because, of course, it's going to ultimately replace at least one layer of the ruling and governing regime if you break off from the more centralized state. So there are always revolutionary aspects even to a secession movement, right? There always has to be this replacement of the old institutions with new institutions that are unconnected to the old institutions, and that's why Rothbard rightly describes the revolution here as a type of civil war in many theaters, right? I know that some libertarians have made this very clear-cut case. Well, if it's a secession, it's not a civil war because civil wars are fights over who controls the government. Secessions are simply attempts to break off. That's true on one level, but it's also true, and this was true in the American Civil War as well, right? Some have said, "Oh, it was just a war for Southern independence. It wasn't a civil war." Yes, well, what about at the more local level? What about the level of state, right? There were numerous conflicts over who controlled the state government and whether those states would actually secede. You encountered lots of guerrilla warfare, conflicts over who controlled at the state level, and those certainly then were civil wars. Maybe the whole conflict overall did not fit the bill of a civil war, but clearly there were many elements of a civil war in those cases. It's true in both the Revolution then and what we now call the American Civil War in most cases. So yeah, of course there's always going to be a civil war element to that because there's going to be fights over who controls the institutions of government at the more local level. So Rothbard is admitting that exists and taking a lot into account, I think, in his own judgment of, okay, do we support the revolution here, even though there's a significant minority? And they were a significant group, although they were in the minority. And this, by the way, is a relevant fact, I think, talking about, okay, well, how much of the population favored the revolution? There's been dispute over that over the years. Okay, how big of a majority, if even a majority, were the American revolutionaries? Rothbard addresses that a bit here in this section. He says, in their grave concern with the American Tories, the American revolutionaries were not striking at phantoms. While the idea that Tory and rebel sentiment among the people was equally matched is a historical misreading of John Adams, it remains true that the Tories constituted a real and substantial threat to the revolution. About 1/3 of politically interested Americans were Tories or Loyalists, while the revolution held the allegiance of the other 2/3. The population of the rebelling colonies at the time of outbreak totaled approximately 2.5 million. And of these, Rothbard says, about 500,000 were Negro slaves who certainly were potential rebels against the revolutionaries, unquote. Potential rebels because the British did engage in a concerted effort to convince slaves that if they joined the British side that they would be freed afterward. That actually didn't happen in many cases. The British shockingly went back on their promises and sent many of these slaves who had attempted to help the British back into slavery in the West Indies, just for an idea of how reliable the British were at the time. So you might have been better off in those cases being left in the colonies, especially in the northern colonies, which after the Revolution then systematically abolished slavery throughout most of those areas. But back to the issue of the population. Yeah, there was a letter by John Adams that is often misinterpreted, Rothbard notes here, where he seemingly says that the Americans were a minority, but Rothbard notes, drawing upon some of the later work of other historians, that no, if you carefully read it, it's clear that Adams thought that a majority of the population was in fact in favor of the revolution. And then Rothbard, of course, offers the evidence as well that no, the military tactics being used, the guerrilla tactics, showed that in fact in most places it was the majority that was in favor of the revolution, but that didn't mean that the Loyalists did not constitute an actual threat, being a sizable minority. But Rothbard then has to make a decision. Okay, well, there's still violence, illegitimate violence in some cases, being exercised by the American revolutionaries in this case. Should I support them or should I support the British? And I think the calculus that Rothbard uses here is developed out of earlier work that he did in his essays Anatomy of the State and War, Peace in the State, which he wrote in the early 1960s. And he's noting, obviously, that not all violence is the same, right? Some violence can be defensive, some violence is state violence, some violence is non-state violence. And Rothbard has actual standards here and rules that he attempts to go by when evaluating, okay, well, when is warfare justified? Contrary to what some people think, and we discussed this as an earlier episode of Radio Rothbard, so I don't want to dwell on it too much. Rothbard was not a pacifist. He clearly supported the use of military-type action when done in self-defense and defense against state violence. There's an important distinction between state violence and non-state defensive violence. And so if you look then at, okay, what was the nature of the violence employed in the Revolution? Well, clearly on the British side, it was mostly state violence. It was state-sponsored violence. It was violence funded by taxes, collected from British subjects, turned into military prowess governed by the oligarchic British state. So Rothbard's looking at that and saying, okay, well, this is illegitimate violence. This is violence conducted by a state apparatus, specifically in this case, to bring to heel breakaway people who were clearly capable of their own self-government and had been largely self-governing for decades at that point, and they wanted to assert new levels of coercion over those groups. So you can choose that side. The other side of choice is the Patriots, who we've established did sometimes use illegitimate violence, but they also used violence in self-defense. Moreover, a lot of that violence used was essentially private, non-state violence. And this is, I think, why Rothbard talks so much about guerrilla warfare, right? Guerrilla warfare, as noted by other scholars, including Max Boot, of all people, in his book Invisible Armies, notes that guerrilla fighting often is independent of any state apparatus. It is funded through private means, often from weapons taken from their adversaries, and often is not directly answerable to any sort of state apparatus. Moreover, as Rothbard notes, guerrilla warfare really does depend generally, if it is to be successful, on having the support of most of the actual resident population. So if you then are choosing sides here, right? Yeah, some violence was enacted by the quasi-state, the very weak state of the American colonies at the time, the Continental Congress, which is certainly by any modern standards, or even the standards of the 18th century, was a very, very weak institution, that they nevertheless were able to field an army to some extent, most of that under the command of Washington. Right? And Washington, I think, did fancy himself as conducting a old school style sovereign state sort of operation. But most of the war, really, especially most of the successful parts of the war, that fighting was not accomplished by Washington. That there was a far more decentralized sort of partisan warfare, guerrilla type of warfare that accomplished most of the successful military goals that were being borne out by the revolution at that time. So if you have to make this choice, then which do you choose? You can choose the British state, which is just a bunch of state violence funded by the oligarchy back in the metropolis, or you can come in on the side of the group that has majority support and which is largely done through non-state or very quasi-state sort of institutions through guerrilla warfare and related types of violence use. So it seems that the answer would be obvious then for Rothbard. So that's then an examination of the means used. That clearly, if we're trying to create an impression of, okay, was this a just war? Was that a just war? And Rothbard clearly recognizes these were not perfect choices. He's not looking for the perfect, pure libertarian answer in this case. He's looking for, well, which is the most just cause that we can join in this case, even if they're sometimes abusing power, which is to be expected in any such case as a revolution like this. So he chooses the Patriots, not surprisingly. So we've established the methods, but what about then the purpose? What was the purpose of this violence being put toward? And it seems that that would be a fairly easy decision as well, right? You had the British state was attempting to assert its own power, reconsolidate the colonists within the larger empire. And there was good reason to believe also, having learned their lesson from letting the colonists rule themselves so completely with so much indirect rule from London, would probably reassert the power of the state, a police state even, martial law for a period to reestablish that rule. And Rothbard certainly doesn't care for that sort of thing. So then he has to look at, okay, what were the revolutionaries trying to accomplish? And on this you get a lengthy discussion in part 4 of volume 4, where he looks at what is this process by which all the various colonies came to the idea that they should declare independence from the British state, and how did they forge these new institutions that created essentially a new political status quo that was no longer royalist, no longer British, no longer mimicking the British state, and no longer something that was potentially in the grip of the old British oligarchy, right? They had to reform their institutions, and Rothbard looks at this process in a lot of detail, how a lot of these states then became hyper-locally ruled, very frequent elections. It became much more legislatively based instead of based on the executive state. It disenfranchised a lot of the old institutions, a lot of the old government corporations that had relied on special favors from the old British state, and of course threw out a lot of the actual individuals that had been in charge of running things before that. And this took place piecemeal in a variety of different states. This was led largely by many of the radicals in New England, especially, but you had a lot of these in Virginia as well. And Rothbard then really breaks up your different options, right? You had the radicals, especially those radicals who were in favor of independence, like John Adams, who very much wanted to ditch all things British at that point. Adams, however, as time wore on, became more and more concerned with establishing the pacification of any revolutionary elements that might undo this independence from Britain, or might, in fact, danger what he saw as more, civilized bourgeois society that he was trying to promote within his own colony. But nevertheless, when it came to really making a clean break with the British, Adams was very much a radical. So he's listed among the radicals there. In Virginia, certainly George Mason and Thomas Jefferson was coming around to this idea. And he talks then about what happened in Virginia in terms of really starting to write down on paper what was the nature of this revolution and what were its goals. And so in the months leading up to the Declaration of Independence, but occurring within Virginia itself, was a new movement toward modifying the Constitution there for the state of Virginia and creating this Declaration of Rights, which was a new thing altogether. Key in that was George Mason, who then Rothbard shows was certainly very influential upon Jefferson's own thought and work in the Declaration of Independence. And Rothbard puts it this way. He's talking about the Virginia Declaration of Rights. He says, drafted almost completely by Mason, the Declaration of Rights was introduced by the committee and modified by the convention. Some of the changes strengthened the Declaration, but the central struggle grew out of the determined attempt by the arch-conservatives to weaken or block it altogether. Patrick Henry, he had his disquieting defection on forbidding ex post facto laws and bills of attainder cut these clauses from the Declaration. But the major battle was waged over its magnificent first clause. Mason had there written, quote, that all men are created equally free and independent and have certain inherent natural rights on which they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, among which are the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and attaining happiness and safety. Unquote. And Rothbard says, here, in a scintillating and compact form, was the essential statement of the radical libertarian theory of natural rights. So if you're familiar with Rothbard, you know he's very much a natural rights theorist. He's going to tend towards supporting the revolutionaries on this, especially as it came to fruition in Virginia in this time period. And this is June 1776. So clearly right up until we start talking about the Declaration of Independence. And the text right here should be clear at how much Jefferson drew upon this with his own text for the Declaration of Independence. So, of course, then by the time we're getting into early July 1776, this ideology, this idea of natural rights, this idea of really breaking free from government control, this idea of protecting property and the legal equality of each individual person starts to really gain some ground and really start to shape the revolution and its ideals. Now, of course, the pedigree of these ideas go back well before June 1776, right? Going back decades really into the popularization that occurs in the early 18th century of John Locke's theories through Cato's letters and other sources. Certainly there's leftover thinking from the English Civil War, right? If you look at today's modern U.S. Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, right? So much of that language is coming from thinking after the English Civil Wars in terms of the right to remain silent, for example, the right to bear arms and to have local militias. A lot of that is coming out of what the Levelers, that is really the world's first libertarians as a true political movement back in the 1600s in England, were thinking in these terms. A lot of that was never forgotten, continued to be discussed into the American Revolution. We see so much of the English Civil War really in the American Revolution, and this idea then of natural rights, which are coming out of really medieval theorists like Thomas Aquinas, this idea of natural law then adopted later by Hooker, and then influential on Locke, who really anglicizes it to some extent and then is popularized among the revolutionaries. And this is where we get all these American ideas then of natural rights, natural law, and which are embodied here in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, but then, of course, translated into the Declaration of Independence shortly thereafter. And this was key as well because revolutions, it's difficult to have one unless you have some sort of mission statement, some sort of unifying ideological idea there. And so while there were a long train of abuses that had led to this desire to separate from, in some way, from the British Empire, it was still unclear exactly what was this imagined goal, really, ideologically, of the revolution. And Rothbard tells us this really then starts to crystallize in July of 1776, a lot of it drawing upon the Virginians here. But then you can see the clear similarity in language that we get in the Declaration of Independence. Right, having already established in the first paragraph of the Declaration that people, in order to protect their rights, should be able to secede from larger polities, from larger states that dominate them. It then goes into the second paragraph and lists these rights, right? What are these rights that allow us to secede? It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. It has to be kept in mind that this is a summary statement, right? Jefferson is really baking it down. He could have been more wordy, as Mason was in the Virginia Declaration, and there are similar texts and similar ideas being bandied about most of the colonies and throughout what would become the United States in general. So these ideas are there for this short statement to the British Crown. Jefferson is really shortening it significantly, and Rothbard provides a good discussion here, right? Never have there been words so greatly abused as maybe the first sentence of this second paragraph, right? That all men are created equal. And then nowadays, in the 20th century, central government, federal judges use this and this ideology as a means of essentially asserting more power for the central government, because we have to make sure that everybody's equal in some way. And of course, Rothbard's saying that Jefferson did not mean that people had equal rights to property or that they were all just equal in some sort of physical way. What he's really trying to address this idea is that you couldn't have government-favored classes of people, those who were friends of the crown, and then everybody else who just had to scrape by while they were being exploited to uphold this noble class, which was not self-sustaining, but which received all sorts of special favors from the regime. That is what they're talking about there, and trying to make this distinction that these old, what they called feudal ideas, but really had very little to do with medieval feudalism, but was really mercantilism. He's saying, yeah, those old mercantilist ideas, the old absolutist ideas that have come down to us somewhat since the 17th century, that's all bunk, right? We don't believe in any of that stuff. We believe now in natural rights, and that the rights of someone who is a friend of the king are not any different from my rights. That's simply what he's trying to say, and also noting that, yeah, people have a right to property and a right to own it. And much has been made of the fact, right, oh, well, he says pursuit of happiness. He doesn't really mean property here. Well, as you get a reading from Mason's statement here, Jefferson's regarding those as part and parcel of the same thing. This idea that Jefferson did not think that life, liberty, and property was a perfectly good formulation, being that that would have been directly from Locke, who was greatly influential on Jefferson, that would make no sense. Clearly, Jefferson had also Locke's words in mind about that, and Mason is clear that we're talking about property here as well, that the right to own property and control your own property, these are the natural rights, which the only legitimate use of government is to protect those rights. And once it starts abusing that, then we can simply overthrow that government, break off, found a new government, do any number of things that we want to do. And then Jefferson goes on to list 27, I believe, different reasons why this secession movement is justified. So I think that really helps us understand a bit of what Rothbard's reasoning was in supporting the revolution over its critics, is that, look, the fact that there were some illegitimate forms of violence used by the revolutionaries against the Loyalists was simply not enough to then conclude that the British were the good guys in this. If we look at their actual use of force by the Patriots and the Americans, which was largely in self-defense, then we have to side with the Americans. And then also, if we're looking at what was the purpose of the revolution, it was to really adopt and promote this idea of natural rights and establishing the fact that the existence of our natural rights means that we can break off from governments when they abuse those rights. And Rothbard, of course, would have noted, as Rothbard's friend, historian Ralph Raico, makes very, very clear in his own history of political thought, that the American Revolution was a secessionist movement. Right? Those same people that Rothbard talks about here, who from the 1950s, these conservatives who were trying to say, oh, well, the revolution was this very mild affair. It was barely violent. It was no big deal. And so if you modern people, you want some sort of revolution, you want some sort of secession movement. That's just beyond the pale, because it wouldn't be as civilized and genteel and wonderful as the American Revolution was, where almost no good people died. And anyone who died in the American Revolution deserved it, basically. This is sort of the myth that has been created. But Rothbard and Rako, as well, most honest scholars, right? When we're looking at actual scholarship on revolutionary movements, on secession movements, on how new states are formed, most of which is in the international relations scholarship, it's all simply accepted that, of course, the American Revolution was a decolonizing war of secession and self-determination. And it was secessionist in nature. This only seems to be denied by Americans on Fox News, pundits, people who basically engage solely in the world of political philosophy and pushing propaganda for their own political causes, who want to deny the idea that this was a secessionist movement. Because why? The American Revolution is still popular in the minds of many Americans, so they need to deny that the American revolutionaries were secessionists, because that might imply that secession is at least sometimes acceptable. So they just straight up deny there was a secession movement, or they'll say it wasn't secession, it was a revolutionary movement. Yeah, okay, that's not actually it's not actually proving any point. Of course secession is a revolutionary movement for reasons we discussed a few minutes ago. And the fact that, yeah, they were overturning some other institutions, that doesn't make it non-secessionist. Clearly, it was secessionist in the way that so many other states have seceded from other states over time, right? The way Norway seceded from Sweden, Malta seceded from the British Empire, countless colonies seceded from the mother countries, Algeria, etc. These are all secessionist movements. And of course, most of these neocons nowadays who tell us how great the Ukrainians are compared to the Russians, well, how do you think Ukraine came to existence? Through a secession movement. So they're defining down secession into this microscopic definition that makes no sense in the real world. But it's all just to the effort of, we can't have secession movements now, so we'll just pretend that the American Revolution wasn't secession. Obviously, Rothbard wasn't going in for that sort of thinking at all. But another claim they'll make is that, the reason for the revolution was taxation without representation. So since you do have representation now, you're never allowed to secede. This, of course, makes a mess of the Declaration of Independence, which is in no way builds an argument that, the only reason that secession is allowed is if you have taxation without representation. Taxation without representation is listed as one of 27 grievances here. And so are we really to believe that if you remove that one grievance, that, secession is no longer allowed because you don't have any of these other grievances? Now, if we actually go through the list of grievances here, a lot of them are relevant today, one of which might be this one, talking about the chief executive, the king. Quote, "He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance." Unquote. Gee, I wonder if the central government of the United States has ever done anything like that. And of course, we can go on and find another group of grievances here that we could apply to the United States today. One being cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, right? By raising tariffs, by prohibiting trade in many cases. This is a point that Rothbard makes in numerous places, is that the revolution was a completely free trade movement. That this was one of their tactics of the revolutionaries, was to completely throw open all American ports to all takers, all countries of the world, and to make America a land of open ports. And then, of course, the Americans supported in many cases people who were illegally importing goods. Smugglers were, of course, a key part of the revolution, and free trade was just a major part of that ideology in general. Another grievance here is for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. This happens all the time in America, especially since the invention of administrative judges in the United States, where now we have consolidated an entire section of what should be in the independent judicial branch and now exists in the executive branch, where if you run afoul of a regulatory agency, you don't get your case heard in the judicial branch. And you're certainly not allowed a trial by jury in those cases. You have to be heard by administrative law judge. An invention of the central executive state So when we go through this list and look at all of this, the idea that, oh, well, there are a few millionaires in Congress. Out of 330 million Americans, we decided there's a few hundred in Congress, 535 if you include the senators, that, and virtually all of whom are millionaires, will get to represent you in Congress. How well do they represent you? Well, the average size of the congressional district is 500,000 people, but I'm sure those millionaires in Congress are very, very sensitive to what your needs are and really, really can represent you clearly. Because you're essentially just like all the other 500,000 people in your congressional district, right? Representation it's easy, right? I mean, it's an absurd argument to make that you're never allowed then to have any sort of revolution or secessionist movement because now you're represented. And all your taxation, that's all purely consensual, right? You consented to all those taxes. You sent your representatives to Congress and they consented to those taxes. That's the absurd claims that are being made when they say, oh, no revolution, no secession ever allowed ever because you do have taxation with representation. These sort of arguments should be considered absurd and totally unrespectable. But when you're in thrall of the government we have now, when you think it's just the greatest thing, and when you want to perpetuate the status quo, then clearly you cannot be sympathetic toward the revolutionaries in any sort of real, meaningful or concrete way. They are this distant ideal that we can speak well of as historical heroes, but we can't actually really allow ourselves to truly sympathize with what they were trying to do or to really see the many ways that we are in a similar position today. But I would say that Rothbard is attempting very, very strenuously to really humanize these Americans of the revolutionary generation, to really show in detail, by going into so much detail and showing the conflicts within these groups, into all of these debates over what shall these new state governments look like, just how different should our new government be from the old government, how persistent were the calls for independence, what did they mean by independence, what sort of military use was employed, were there abuses. Rothbard doesn't shy away from discussing any of this, and still, of course, then comes down on the side of the American revolutionaries, and in his work broadly here, as well as broadly throughout much of his work, is that, yeah, of course, if governments are violating your rights, regardless of whether you have quote-unquote representation, yes, secession. Secession is an acceptable thing to do, and obviously, in many, many cases, it has been an acceptable thing to do because, of course, there have been dozens and dozens cases of secession since 1945 as some countries have broken away from other countries. And Rothbard is totally uninterested in simply saying, well, the American government's pretty good, doing a pretty good job, so no secession allowed. No, he's building, I think, a case throughout Conceived in Liberty that radicalism was, in fact, the thing that America was founded in, that America was founded on these very radical ideals of natural rights and was truly engaged in breaking from the past. And it's very important that we not associate this movement and this reality of the 1770s with what came afterward, because Rothbard is very clear, in fact, that the Constitutional Convention of the 1780s was essentially a betrayal of the ideals of the revolution. So I just wanted to give you an idea, I think, of some of the ideas that are contained in this huge monumental work, Conceived in Liberty. If you've never really engaged with it before, I would definitely recommend it, and perhaps with some of these sections that we discussed in Volume 4. In fact, oddly enough, Volume 4 might be the best place to start if you're interested in these sorts of things, because the first 3 volumes go into a lot of detail about pre-revolutionary America, right? Going back to the 1600s and the formation of these colonies and early conflicts with the Spaniards and those sorts of things. And that's all good and should be read. But if you're just trying to, I think, start reading here, I maybe would recommend just start with Volume 4 so that you can get right into the meat of the revolution and the Declaration of Independence and when events really start to accelerate during that time period. So consider some of this when you're celebrating this July 4th, right? Let's not make it into something where we're celebrating the U.S. military, where we're celebrating the U.S. government, we're celebrating some vague idea of America. The focus really should be on the Declaration of Independence itself, the revolution and the Revolutionary War, and how truly courageous it was, and how it was a break with so much of what came before in terms of oppressive states, absolutism, mercantilism, and so on. So thanks for listening here on this edition of Radio Rothbard. We'll be back next time with more. We'll see you then.